Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to our members of council, to the MEC, the ELG, our staff and students and friends of UJ. My name is Maria Frahm-Arp, and I'm the Executive Director here at the library. And we are delighted to welcome you to this book reading, which is going to be led by Mr. Mike Teke. He is the University of Johannesburg's Chair of Council. And last year, he did some readings with us and asked some very provocative questions and helped us to think about South Africa, our role in the country, and what kind of future we collectively be shaping, particularly in a place like the University of Johannesburg. Today, Mr. Teke is going to be looking at the book Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. And for those of you that have read it, I thought it was a thought-provoking, challenging, and at times somewhat depressing book. So, Mr. Teke, we are very keen to hear your take on this book, and I'm going to hand over to you in just a minute. I just want to clear one or two housekeeping things. The first is that we will have a questions and answer session in the second half of our session. So Mr. Teke is going to begin by giving us his reflections on the book and an overview of the book. And then it will be up to you in the audience to write your questions in the Q&A section, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can. We have an hour together, and I am sure that it's going to be thought-provoking, challenging, and very interesting. So, Mr. Teke, thank you once again for taking time out to be with us, and it's over to you.
I'd like to talk to you about Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. Why this book? In the first place, in our country, we talk about trust. In our country, we talk about meeting people. And in our lives, every day, we talk to people. And I keep on using people first before I can call them strangers. This book written by Malcolm Gladwell, let me start talking about the author first. He's written several books: The Tipping Point, Outliers, Blink, David and Goliath, What the Dog Saw. And amongst those books, I felt that I should look at Talking to Strangers. In fact, I bought this book last year for my team in December as a gift, simply because I started to notice that communication is gaining prominence in our lives. And if you read the New York Times, the New York Times in 2019 was talking about who's lying to us and who's telling the truth. And in that piece of writing from the New York Times, one of the captured a statement where they said, "We have a hard time with truth tellers who look suspicious and liars who look sincere." We have a hard time with truth tellers who look suspicious and liars who look sincere. And I felt that let's talk about that book. And in the book, you'll realize that one of the academics, it's a psychologist by the name of Timothy Levin, who's a distinguished professor and chair of the communication studies at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And he talks about a theory that's called the truth default theory, that human beings, all of us, or most of us, we default to truth. When we meet people, when we introduce ourselves to people, we default to truth. And he says the basic idea of the truth, the truth default theory is that when we communicate with other people, we not only tend to believe them, but the thought that maybe we shouldn't does not even come to mind. So there are two reasons why we should believe people. First and most important, the truth default is needed for communication to function. Second, most people are mostly honest most of the time. So when you look at the theory, then what Malcolm Gladwell has done in this book, he then looks at different case studies that provoke the way you think about truth telling and the way you think about meeting strangers. And I'll give you an example about myself in business. When we buy businesses, we evaluate businesses through what we call data rooms, or people supply us with information or financial information about the business. When we meet people in business, we read the financials, we understand the business. But what is very important, then you meet the owners of the business. When you meet those people that you look at them, you understand the way they behave, and it's out of that that you default to the truth and trust them and believe in them. And if they are good people, they will be good people. But later, when things don't turn right, you realize that your mistake was to default to the truth. Now, if you read this book, one of the statements that I'd like to start, it's the story about judges in court. And Prof. Marwala, you'll appreciate they talk about judges when they were compared with a computer. When a judge has to give somebody a bail in a court of law, and when a man from Texas, 1 year, on page 164 of the book, I want to start with that statement. On page 164, some years ago, there was a famous case in Texas in which a young man named Patrick Dale Walker put a gun to his ex-girlfriend's head, only to have the gun jam as he pulled the trigger. The judge in his case set the bail at $1 million, then lowered it to $25,000 after Walker spent 4 days in jail on the grounds that this was long enough for him to cool off. Walker, the judge explained later, had nothing on his record, not even a traffic ticket. He was polite. He was a really low-key, mild-mannered young man. The kid, according to the judge, from what I understand, is a real smart kid. He was a valedictorian of his class. He graduated from college. This was supposedly his first girlfriend. Most important, according to the judge, Walker showed remorse. What happened? Later, when Walker had been released, Walker, who had put a gun to his girlfriend's head and failed to kill her only because the gun misfired, 4 months later, while out on bail, Walker shot his girlfriend to death. That's how the whole story about defaulting to truth. And that has impacted on judges. That is why, Prof. Marwala, when I link the judges compared to the computer, and they realize that the computer would do better because there's no personal interaction between the computer and and the judge. The second case, it's two cases that I want to link to this. It's a case that relates to a doctor by the name of Dr. Larry Nassar. Dr. Larry Nassar was an interesting case in that, if you read in the book, he served as a team physician for the US Gymnastics women's national team. He was a bespectacled, garrulous, and a little bit awkward. He seemed harmless. This gentleman was a doctor who was treating gymnasts who suffered from pelvic floor dysfunction. And for some reason, when he treated the patients, the young ladies, in his rooms, he did a procedure that effectively led to the abuse of these women because he penetrated them with his fingers. And what had happened is that every time this doctor met these patients, their parents were in the room and they believed in the doctor that he was doing the right thing. And what is interesting about Dr. Nassar, it's a case that surprised everybody because one of the most important people in this case, it's a person by the name of Trinia Gonza, who was treated by this doctor 856 times. And when she was told that Nassar had put fingers inside her and said to this young lady, that's Gonzaga, Trinia Gonzaga telling a young lady, he said, he does that to me all the time. This is Trinia Gonzaga. And the point she was making was that I trust the doctor. This is the procedure that he has to do on me, and don't worry about it. But then later, after she had discovered, she was convinced that this doctor is going to be exonerated. In fact, Before I told you the story of what Trinia Gonza says, there was a professor, the dean of the osteopathic medicine at Michigan State University, who told students one day, this just goes to show that none of you learned the most basic lesson in medicine, which is medicine 101. Don't trust your patients. Patients lie to get doctors in trouble. And that was Kathy Klages had the gymnasts on her team sign a card to Dr. Nessa one day to say, we're thinking of you. Now, what ultimately happened to Larry Nessa? That lady, Trinia Gonza, turns around one day and she says at Nasser's trial, when she joined the chorus of the victims testifying against him, she gave in to those doubts. And he said, I had to make an extremely hard choice this week, Larry, saying that to the doctor. I had to choose whether to continue supporting you through this or to support them, the girls. I choose them, Larry. I choose to love them and protect them. I choose to stop caring for you and supporting you. The bottom line with this case, ladies and gentlemen, is that listen to this statement, which is written in italics when you read the book. I believed in you always until I couldn't anymore. Isn't that an almost perfect statement of default to truth? That's what she did, defaulting to truth, believing that Larry Nessa was doing his job. In fact, one of the patients of Dr. Larry Nessa was sitting in the room with Dr. Larry Nessa performing that procedure on her daughter, and the lady who was sitting in the room was a medical doctor as well, and she never suspected Larry Nessa. The third case, therefore, is the case that relates to Jerry Sadunski. Jerry Sadunski was obsessed with boys. He was involved with them in the team. He played ball with them. And until there were suspicions about him, it led to a situation where one of the people who saw him in a shower, sharing a shower with a young man or a young boy at the time, it turned out later, when questions were asked to a young gentleman by the name of Alan Myers, that did Mr. Sadunski do anything to you? And he said no. And then he flipped at a later stage to turn and tell the truth about it. That's default to truth. Those are the cases that tend to shake the world, that shake people, that make us believe that, hang on, what people tell us, what is it that makes us not to believe them? When you interview somebody for a job, and there's a story here where Malcolm Gladwell says, when you recruit for a babysitter, what would you like to do? You'd like to sit with that person. You'd like to talk to that person. You'd like to look at that person in the eye. And that's the theory of defaulting to truth. But there are other cases, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to touch on that are very important. We were born in a world believing that the USA being a powerful country, and we know of Cuba, which is a small country that has given the USA quite a number of headaches. We know very well of Fidel Castro. We know that a lot of American presidents have always had trouble with dealing with Cuba. And President Barack Obama reached the stage where he recognized Cuba. But when you read this book, you read about a lady by the name of Ana Belén Montes. And this lady was called the Queen of Cuba. Now, the interesting thing about Ana Belén Montes, they call her the Queen of Cuba. She was a spy. She worked for the Defense Intelligence Agency in the United States of America. And we all believe as people in the world that America has got the best spy network, the best intelligence teams in the world. And when you read this book, you discover that Ana Belén Montes's younger brother, Tito, was an FBI agent. His sister, her sister, was an FBI agent. Her boyfriend worked at the Pentagon. specializing in Latin American intelligence. And what happens to Anna Belen Mentez? She sits with a gentleman by the name of Scott Carmichael, who interviews her intensely, asks her questions about her involvement in the spy ring and working with Cuba. And it took years and years because people defaulted to the truth. They believed in her, and she was decorated. She was one of the best in the intelligence circles in the United States of America. We all know that America is regarded, when people commit crimes in different parts of the world, the first thing you think of is, we must talk to the CIA. And the biggest challenge, if you read this book, you discover that Ana Belen Mentez is in prison now because she was a double spy. She worked for Cuba. She worked for Fidel Castro. In fact, she had met Fidel Castro. What happened there? Did someone default to the truth, to believing Ana Belen Mentez? Why, when strangers are presented to us, when they present themselves to us, we don't ask the next question? Let's talk about another interesting case. It's the case of Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Britain. Before the Second World War, Neville Chamberlain made it his responsibility that indeed one day I'd like to go and meet with Adolf Hitler, Chancellor Adolf Hitler. He made it a point that I'd like to go and sit with Adolf Hitler and listen to him and look at him in the eye, because it is important that the world must avoid a Second World War. He went there for the first time. He came back to Britain, assuring the British population that I've met Chancellor Adolf Hitler and I believe in him. The only thing he wants as Germany, he wants that small part of Czechoslovakia called Sudetenland. I believe in him. The second time he went back and he had consulted his intelligence people, he had consulted his foreign policy people, and he met Adolf Hitler, and he still believed in Hitler. And the third time he met him. How do you feel as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain when you discover that this is the man who starts the Second World War, when he gave you the assurance that it's not going to happen? It happens to most of us, it happens to all of us, believing that what the stranger tells you, it's what you believe, you don't take it a step further. But in the book, Malcolm Gladwell talks about the Holy Fool. Now, the story of the Holy Fool is an interesting story, which I'll touch on later. The first important part I must start on first before I talk to you about the Holy Fool. What is the Holy Fool? The Holy Fool in Russian folklore, they talk about the one who acts intentionally foolish in the eyes of men. The one who acts intentionally foolish in the eyes of men. And in this book, there are several characters who are like that. And I'll talk about the first one by the name of Harry Markopoulos. Harry Markopoulos is the man who was very restless, who was really concerned about a gentleman by the name of Benny Madoff. He was deeply concerned about Benny Madoff because Benny Madoff was this man who spent time in Wall Street in a beautiful building called the Lipstick Building. He was the man who looked after the finances of people in Europe, in the USA. And again, ladies and gentlemen, the USA is known because they have great institutions. One of those institutions beyond the CIA, the DIA, you have the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission. You know, if you commit a crime related to share trading, stock market manipulation, insider trading, the first thing you worry about is the SEC internationally, that if they lay their hands around your case, you know that you are in trouble. And Harry Markopolos worked hard to convince them that there was something about Bernie Madoff. And he kept on asking those questions. And there was a time when people were saying, Bernie Madoff is so brilliant, he can see around the corners. And that is why he never lost money. He was great. He was looking after the finances of great people. But something happened when Bernie Madoff was discovered to be running a Ponzi scheme. And I'm sure all of you know that the rest is history. Where's Bernie Madoff now? And Harry Markopolos is one of those people. They don't default to truth. They are the holy fools. The emperor has no clothes. They can see that. Now, if you think of people like Harry Markopolos, how many of these do we have in society? And that's the case where I've mixed the financial. The best thing that Malcolm Gladwell has done with his cases, he has given you a number of cases in different parts of our lives, be it in medicine, be it in our social life, be it in the court of law, be it in any other situation. Now, what has worried a lot of people is the fact that even big institutions like the SEC, which Malcolm Gladwell spends time on, he talks about people believing that the people who are being suspected, there's nothing wrong about it. There's nothing wrong about them because those who were receiving the information were defaulting to truth. I want to read something to you, ladies and gentlemen, before I touch the case that has worried me deeply as well. In Malcolm Gladwell's book, on page 342, he writes that this has been a book about a conundrum. We have no choice but to talk to strangers, especially in our modern borderless world. We aren't living in villages anymore. Police officers have to stop people they do not know. Intelligence officers have to deal with deception and uncertainty. Young people want to go to parties explicitly to meet strangers. That's part of the thrill of romantic discovery. Yet, at this most necessary of tasks, we are inept. We think we can transform the stranger without cost or sacrifice into the familiar and the known, and we can't. The question is, what should we do? The question is, what should we do? Now, if that's the question that says, what should we do? There is an interesting case now I want to touch on. It's a case of a lady by the name of Sandra Bland. The case of Sandra Bland relates to the case of a young lady who came from Illinois. And this lady did something interesting. She went to study in Texas. And she used to have a podcast. You can go reach her podcast on YouTube, where she greets people and says, my kings and queens. And this lady met a policeman, Brian Insenia. And Brian Insenia stopped this young lady on the road in Texas because this lady hadn't signaled a lane change. And this book captures the interaction or the conversation between these two parties. And in the conversation gets heated. And it reaches a stage where, unfortunately, Mr. Brian Insenia ends up taking Sandra Bland to prison. And the lady gets imprisoned. And once she's in prison, 3 days later, she commits suicide. And that's the end of Sandra Bland. A lot of people racialized this case, made it black and white, justifiably, so we know the path of Black Lives Matter, which is very important to our lives. But it is important to read a small passage that relates to Sandra Bland. When Malcolm Gladwell writes, he says, we are now close to returning to the events of that day in Prairie View, Texas, when Brian Insenia, the policeman, pulled Sandra Bland. She pulled her over. But before we do, we have one last thing to consider. the strangely overlooked phenomenon of coupling. Well, what they're talking about is to talk about what happens when two people like these, they meet each other, they are strangers, they don't know each other. The other one crosses the line and says something, and the other one ends up saying wrong things. For instance, in a situation where Sandra Bland, as he was talking to Brian Insigne, the policeman, she pulls out a cigarette, she lights a cigarette, and probably that agitates and makes this gentleman angry. So the key question that we sit with as human beings, defaulting to truth, we ask ourselves a big question and say, should we stop talking to strangers? No, we can't. Because every day we want to talk to strangers. Every day we believe in talking to strangers. But where do you stop? Where do you draw the line that, am I being told the truth or am I not being told the truth? And Sandra Bland found herself on the road, first time in Texas, meeting a policeman, Brian Insigne, and Brian Insigne, who acted by the rules. And why some of the people doubted that it's a racialized issue, they say because Brian Insigne was taught that he must, the book that he was trained on, he must make sure that whoever he stops, and on that day it was recorded that he had stopped 8 people. And truth of the matter is that in stopping all those people, some of the things are seen as insignificant, and the lady ends up in prison. And when the lady ends up in prison, the lady commits suicide. And this book touches on 2 other concepts, which you will spend time and read on them. You'll need more time and days to read this book because I like it. It touches 2 other concepts, the concept of coupling and displacement, where you talk about the most popular, one of the popular poets by the name of Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath is one of those poets who committed suicide because she suffered from depression, and how it happened. Yes, she was obsessed with suicide, but the question you're being asked is, she gassed herself in her flat, but the view is, should somebody have seen this coming? Should this be discovered by somebody that she was prone to do something like this? And you look at the other poet by the name of Annie Sexton, who again committed suicide. I'd like to read a portion on page 45. And this portion, it's about relationship where I spoke about Hitler and Chamberlain. And it says here, in March 1939, Hitler invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. It had taken him less than 6 months to break his agreement with Chamberlain. On the 1st of September 1939, Hitler invaded Poland and the world was at war. We have, in other words, CIA officers who cannot make sense of their spies, judges who cannot make sense of their defendants, and prime ministers who cannot make sense of their adversaries. We have people struggling with their first impressions of a stranger. We have people struggling when they have months to understand a stranger. We have people struggling when they meet with someone only once, and people struggling when they return to the stranger again and again. They struggle with assessing the stranger's honesty. They struggle with the stranger's character. They struggle with the stranger's intent. It's a mess. And that's the story of what Malcolm Gladwell talks about. At the start of the book, there's a fascinating thing. His father, Malcolm Gladwell's father, comes to visit him in New York. And Malcolm Gladwell says his father likes to talk to strangers. And he says, my father likes to talk to strangers. So when he picked him up at the hotel one evening for dinner, his father said to him, I met somebody here. I was talking to somebody here at reception at the hotel. And he says to him, who is he? Do you know him? And he said, no, I don't know. But I noticed that as I was standing talking to him, people were coming to this person asking for autographs or signing something. And so you notice in a joking way where Malcolm Gladwell in the book says, please, somebody in Hollywood who met the person who looks like this, that's my father. The point I'm making is that we don't know who you meet, we don't know who we meet, and when we interact with those people, it becomes critical in our lives that we make sense of what these people talk about. There's a case that fascinated me, and I'd like to touch on that. Would be the last one probably, and then we can open up for questions. What happens when the stranger is a terrorist? Again, this happens in the USA, where Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, they call him KSM, who was one of those terrorists who were responsible for the 2001 September 11 case in the United States. We know the bombing of the Twin Towers. James Michel and Bruce Jessen were two of those people who were given the task of interrogating this man. And the key question about it is, what happened? What did their efforts yield? Did they achieve something in talking to this man? James Michel, the CIA had reason to believe that Al-Qaeda was planning a second round of attacks after 9/11, possibly involving nuclear weapons. He had to get KSM to talk. But the harder he worked to get KSM to talk, the more he compromised the quality of their communication. Whatever it is we are trying to find out about strangers in our midst is not robust. The truth about Amanda Knox was the one who was accused of murder in Italy of her roommate, and later she was acquitted. Jerry Sadunsky, or KSM, is not some shiny object that we're looking for. We are not expected only to dig long hard enough. The thing we want to learn about a stranger is one big lesson. It's a fragile thing. If we tread carelessly, it will crumble under our feet. And from that follows a second cautionary note. We need to accept that the search to understand a stranger has limits, real ones. We will never know the whole truth. We have to be satisfied with something short of that. What is the right way to talk to strangers? The right way to talk to strangers is with caution and humility. How many of the crises and controversies that have been described in this book have been prevented had they taken the lessons to heart? And how many of us in this world live with what we call the holy fool? You remember Harry Markopoulos. Harry Markopoulos raised the concern that he didn't understand what was happening with Benny Madoff. He didn't understand why this Benny Madoff was doing what he's doing. He flew to Europe. He went to the SBC. He presented to Congress, to government. He spoke to everybody about Benny Madoff. And later we discovered that this man was indeed running a Ponzi scheme. What happens in a communication situation where students at a university, it happened at Stanford, where there was a miscommunication between two students, and they ended up sleeping together, and the other one accused the other one of rape. What did the other stranger say to the other one? The most important part about this book for me, it's therefore the cases that are presented from different parts of the world and different parts of our lives. But the more important lesson is the one that I've shared with you, that we have to be satisfied with what we get. The right way to talk to a stranger is with caution and humility. I've been caught in a situation where, and I've given you the example earlier, where you buy a business, you do a due diligence, the numbers tend not to lie because they are there, they are on paper, they are signed by auditors. But then you meet the owners of the business, eyeball to eyeball. At times it's families, a family, father, son, and children, and the wife. But you default to truth. You believe them, you walk away. And a year later, when the results are different, you start to say, what happened? What did I miss in that conversation? It happens when we interview people for jobs. Do they give you any verbal cues? Do they behave in a particular way that you start not to believe them, or we all default to truth? And when we walk out of the interview room, we shake our heads and say, that's our candidate. On that afternoon, when Brian and Senior stopped Sandra Bland, you can make it racial. That is why Black Lives Matter was born. And we know that people died in the US in the hands of the police, and it has become a black and white issue. Yes, I understand, and it's painful. But what happens when the strangers meet? Would Brian and Senior have behaved differently had it been a different colored person, maybe a white woman? We don't know. 3 days later, Sandra Bland took her life. What happened to that young man who the judge gave him a bail because he was a valedictorian? He was a good man. He was a smart young man. And months later, he shot his girlfriend and killed her. It's those cases that Malcolm Gladwell talks about. And today you look back and say, would Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of Britain, behave differently had he not defaulted to truth? And what would have happened had the SEC, Securities Exchange Commission in the US, listened to Harry Markopoulos when he kept on making noise about Bernie Madoff? Let me pause there. Let's talk questions, ladies and gentlemen.
Mr. Teke, that was captivating, and I thought a fantastic overview of the book. I'm going to kick off the questions with a question for myself, and that is, I struggled with the theory of trust default theory, this idea that we default to trust. And I was thinking about this particularly in the context of young women living in South Africa, walking on the streets, sort of everyday life. I'm not sure that at the moment we actually default to trust. And I wonder what you think that does to us as a society, because the way Malcolm presents this theory, it's the idea that our social fabric is really, on one level, held together by this default to trust theory.
You know, I reflected on a case of that young lady, Amanda Knox, who was accused in Italy of the death of her roommate, and you'll read more about that. And I said nobody wanted to believe her until later she was acquitted. I reflected on the case of the gentleman and the young lady at Stanford University who had some drinks, and they ended up in another situation. And I'm saying, I have a daughter, and I reflect on that, and you heard me reading a section where the Malcolm Gladwell says young ladies go out there to seek fun and happiness in an environment. And I say, this book is teaching us that those people who are in front of us, they may be good looking, they may be the greatest of speakers, they may convince you of tell you of a great story. There's no shiny object that we are looking for from these people. And I think, much as I would say it's good to default to truth, but I think it is important that people step back, act with humility, and start to think twice. And it's a lesson that's hard because some of us, we make snap decisions, we get excited in environments that we shouldn't be getting excited about. And we should be starting to ask questions. Is this the right decision? Is this the right person to take a lift, and will they take me home in their car? And will they drop me home as they committed? And that's the message that I'd like to pass on. It happens with us in the world where at university, we're running a university, and we believe that the students who are walking in our campuses are safe because their classmates, who happen either to be male or female and strong, will look after them. Is that default to truth? We believe them, we trust them. Are they not the ones who will turn on us? I think it's time that we start to dig deeper into the way we do things.
Thank you so much. Just picking up on the idea of trusting, Prof. Stradom has put something here saying, thank you for an absorbing discussion. Thinking of the business world, would you say that the encroachment of artificial intelligence in all spheres of life is going to make people in business more or less trusting of the strangers they work with?
I think they are going to trust less. You know, I've observed right now when you attend these meetings with COVID-19, you attend these meetings, there's a new trend. I don't know whether people have seen it in business, and it happens at university because I'll call a university a business. People would say, can you tape this meeting? Can you record this meeting? You know, the trust relationship is gone. In the past, people used to write minutes. That's number one. Number two, when we interview people, I'll give you an interesting example. When you interview people, you're no more relying on friends, that people have got 3 friends. Let's make a reference. Let's phone 3 friends and ask them if they know this person. What these days we do, we go to the intelligence people or we go to the police and we say, does this person have a criminal record? Has this person committed any crime? Even if we're looking for a position where there will be no harm in this person, whether he was a criminal or not. So it's going to lead to less trust. It's going to create more vigilance amongst people. And people will walk into meetings very soon. And I've seen it in some areas where people would say, please leave your cell phone outside, because we don't trust that you're going to record the things on the cell phone. And it is imperative, I've noticed in business again, that sending around SMSs or WhatsApps and the like, people are very cagey and careful these days because things are recorded. And I blame it on Prof. Marwa.
Thank you very much for that. There's another question here. In the book, there is a section where he talks about alcohol.
The Myopia Theory, yes.
And I wonder if you could just elaborate more on that, especially given South Africa and, for example, our ban on alcohol as a way to deal with COVID.
Our ban on alcohol to deal with COVID. I hope I'm not going to get into trouble with people who love alcohol, you know, because I don't like alcohol. So I want to read a small passage about it. It says, the myopia theory was first suggested by psychologists Claude Steele and Robert Josephs. And that what they meant by myopia is that alcohol's principal effect is to narrow our emotional and mental fields of vision. It creates, in their words, a state of short-sightedness in which superficially understood immediate aspects of experience have a disproportionate influence on behavior and emotion. So if you read that, then they say alcohol makes the thing in the foreground even more salient and the thing in the background less significant. And they make an example of the community in Bolivia who get drunk and somebody went to visit them and realized that the type of behavior they see is completely different from where they come from. And they made this example. Here's an example. He said, lots of people drink when they are feeling down because they think it will chase their troubles away. That's inhibition thinking. Alcohol will unlock my good mood. But that's plainly not what happens. Sometimes alcohol cheers us up, but at other times, when an anxious person drinks, they just get more anxious. So for me, in this COVID-19 environment, my biggest concern is, one, had we not banned alcohol during the highest wave of COVID, were we not going to see people saying, let me drown my sorrows, I'll drink alcohol, and I don't care. And then we wake up in the morning and you feel guilty that, where was I? Did I touch anything? Did I meet anybody who was not well? Was anybody coughing or sneezing in front of me? I don't know. But I would prefer that let's err on the side of caution and not open up alcohol when this virus is attacking us seriously.
Thank you very much for that. Another question, are we defaulting to truth or defaulting to believe in truth and trusting in a lie? And are we not being exhorted to be higher and less cynical. Great talk. Thank you.
You heard when I started, when the New York Times summed it up, they said, we have a hard time with truth tellers who look suspicious and liars who look sincere. We have a hard time with truth tellers who look suspicious and liars who are sincere, look sincere. I believe we default to truth because as Malcolm Gladwell says, is that it's the way we are as human beings. But until somebody does something that becomes suspicious, then we start to wake up to believing that this is not the truth. So the next person must behave in a particular way to make us suspicious. If they don't, like Ana Belén Montez, who was asked a question about her relationship with Cuba, she was not shaken. And Scott Carmichael couldn't pick it up. That here I'm dealing with a Cuban double spy.
So picking up on that point, somebody has, Sifiso, has posted something that's very interesting and it's quite provocative. You'll see there's a question right at the end. So he says, this is more of a comment, but Mr. Teke is one of the few South Africans I look up to. I've always wanted to meet him and ask him a few questions. Sometime in 2019, I saw him driving by in Kwatemba near Johannesburg, and I immediately wanted to stop him. But then I asked myself, why would a known businessman like him allow himself to be stopped by a stranger who can potentially be a hijacker or even a criminal? I think this comment says an enormous amount about our country, and I wonder if you'd like to comment further.
That's very true, because there are people who are very sincere. They'll stop you, they want to talk to you. Yes, I come from Kwatemba in a township, yes, and that person is telling the truth. I'd love to stop and talk to people, especially young people. They'd like to talk to me, but no doubt, no harm at all. The challenge you're sitting with is the second part of the question that says, why? And wouldn't the world punish me one day and say, why did you stop? Because I defaulted to the truth. I trusted the stranger.
Another question that we have is, you talked about the holy fool. So when people can see that something is going wrong, they can see through the facade, particularly in a political context. How do we address this? And what lessons can we learn from Gladwell to apply to South Africa?
When you read about the holy fool, Malcolm Gladwell equates the holy fool to the whistleblower. The whistleblower, you hear in businesses, we have a whistleblower line where we say to people, we encourage you to phone us and tell us. He equates that to the holy fool. And in South Africa, we must encourage the whole principle of whistleblowing. But again, whistleblowing comes with the negative side to it, where you don't know whether somebody's jealous of somebody, or it's professional jealous, or it's business jealous, or it's friendship, where somebody says, do you know that that person suffers from A, B, C, D? I'm warning you as an organization, investigate this person. And you find that it happens to your most trusted of employees. How do you deal with it? And the holy fool, in South Africa, we have whistleblowers. How do we protect them? How do we look after them? We saw what happened in some of the cases at the Zondo Commission when we were so-called whistleblowers or witnesses who didn't want to be known. They were treated when their names get disclosed. So the story of the holy fool is a serious story. But my impression is we have a lot of Harry Markopouloses, people who are standing there and saying, I can see through this, there's no truth in this, whilst if there are 100 people in the room, 99 will disagree with the holy fool and say, no, this man is real. This woman is real. Let's believe in them. And you discover that actually the holy fool is right.
Yeah, I think if we look at, for example, the Cheryl Zondi case in 2018 against one of these pastors is a case in point, where so many people were saying, I mean, how can she possibly be right? This is a holy man, etc. And yet she had the courage to stand up. We have another question that's also very provocative. Mr. Teke, how does this mistrust of strangers undermine Ubuntu?
It does undermine Ubuntu because if a stranger showed up at my home in Guatemala as a Black child and a person says to me, I don't have a place to sleep tonight, I lose that sense of Ubuntu of saying, let's have dinner, have a great shower or a bath. Well, we never had showers and baths in the township years back. Sleep well. In the morning, we will help you. That's Ubuntu. That's the sense of Ubuntu. But because of this, of what we've been talking about, we're starting not to trust the stranger. We're starting to say, why did you choose this house? Why did you come here? So truth is, yes, it does undermine it. The second part is, I've got young students who will talk to me about seeking help, bursaries, and the like. You don't know who to trust. You don't have a test that you can run with people and say, this is a trusted young student. She will do well or he will do well and pass well. It takes away that humanity in you. It takes away that Ubuntu. And it's because of us human beings. It's a self-inflicted thing. We started it.
Then I think we've got about time for one or two more questions. And so I'm going to pick out a particular question that goes back to gender-based violence. So Malcolm Gladwell talks about the case of KSM, the terrorist. Yes. And he talks a lot about how when we traumatize somebody, they actually find it much more difficult to tell the truth. And he has a very interesting example of people in the military being traumatized and then not actually being able to remember a particular picture or event. How does this then link to things like gender-based violence? When people have gone through a trauma, but then have to remember clearly the facts, the times, etc., in order to convict the person that has abused them. Do you have any ideas about what we can do about this?
The story of one being careful, the second part of humility and respect is very important. I'll tell you why. When you read the article, it's in the book, but in the article, the New York Times talk about, they say, Malcolm Gladwell says, a young woman and a young man meet at a party, then proceed to tragically misunderstand each other's intentions, and they are drunk. And then you have a woman going to the police and saying, this is what happened. And probably some of the people who may not, I underline that, who may not be professional, ridicule the young woman. What were you doing there? Why were you drunk? It's terrible. As human beings, we must start respecting the story that we hear. And I hear a lot of people talking about gender-based violence and say, what about us men? What happens if a man is abused by another man or a man is abused by a woman? We must be able as well, if these people start to talk about something like that. It's not because what type of man are you that you are abused by women, or what type of man are you that you were abused? We need to start to understand that we need to respect each other across the gender lines. It's very important. I work in the mining industry. One of the things that used to worry me, and now it doesn't because I've seen huge improvements, a female working underground with men, one female being a shift boss, working with 20 men underground to go and dig coal, as an example. It's based on trust that this woman must be protected by these men. But at the same time, you want this woman not to worry about being protected by these men, that she must feel safe and empowered that these are other human beings. So it is very important that dealing with the sensitivity of gender-based violence, humility and respect play an important role. And we must teach each other. We must teach each other as we go along.
And relating to this, there's a last comment. The caveat about defaulting to truth is that our entire legal system, courts of law, prosecution, and defense, are all based upon the fact that people default to being economical with the truth.
I'm sure you heard when I spoke about the judges compared with the computer, that a judge says, I feel remorse that this man is not going to do anything. I trust this man. Let's give him a smaller bail than a big bail. He's already been in prison for a month or something like that. I sympathize when I hear him, he's telling the truth. Then you give that person bail, and then tomorrow they commit a crime. What do? And it is imperative that our courts of law as well. Probably AI will help us, but at the end of the day, there is this thing that we look for inside a human being that's called the truth. And how we find it, ladies and gentlemen, that's why I chose this book, that we need to reflect amongst ourselves.
Mr. Teke, we've come to the end of our hour with you. This has been a most engaging and provocative conversation. And I think for those people that haven't had a chance yet to read the book, this will have inspired them to go and get a copy and read this book, because I think it has a lot for us to think about in our society and how we go on to create a better society. And I really appreciated your idea that we need to have more humility when we engage with other people. So thank you very much. And thank you very much to all our participants who've been here today and for all the questions. Mr. Teke, we look forward to the next reading group and the book that you will choose for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.